Hi. So, last video I decided that I wanted to share with you some experiences of women that were involved in polygamy in the 1800s. And just want to tell this cool story about this lady. Her name's Margaret Cooper West, and she was married to Samuel Walker West. They were married in around 1828. So they joined the church, and polygamy didn't start till probably, it began to be practiced among members of the church in 1840s in Nauvoo. So they were married and had almost all their, they had all their children before polygamy became an issue for them, because they were just a little kind of on the older end of that cycle. So I wanted to talk about some of her experiences, because she had a really cool experience. She said, I'm going to read some of her stuff because it's so good, but she has this kind of a cool quote, and she says that she was living in Nauvoo. So Nauvoo started to be built around 1839, and this isn't dated. It was reported in I think one of the church publications in 1882. But so she doesn't have dates with this, but she does say she was living in Nauvoo. So we would know it'd be somewhere, and Joseph Smith was still alive. So it would be somewhere between 1840 and 1844, mid 1844. So she says, we were living in Nauvoo when I first heard that it was right for men to have two wives. So she's starting to hear rumors, right? And she said, I never thought of them having more than two at the time. It looked like an awful thing to me. I said I would not believe it was right if an angel from heaven should tell me so. And again, I said that if I should hear the Almighty tell an angel to come and tell me it was right, I would not believe it, and I knew very well what I thought. End of quote. So this is totally normal reaction for some of these women, and actually the men too that were first learning about polygamy. It was totally against their sensibilities. It wasn't a Western thing. It seemed like a very archaic, primitive type of an institution. We're just coming up on the Victorian era here pretty soon, so that was just totally embarrassing. Several of the women talk about how when this idea would come up, and they would be like, how could I ever show my face in public again? It was just such a personal destruction of your reputation to even consider going into polygamy. So anyway, that was her feeling. She said, I knew very well what I thought. I didn't care if an angel came and told me that. I didn't care if I heard God tell an angel to tell me that. I wasn't going to believe it. Okay, so then she said, so this is great, because I think it's good for women to think about today. But so she first hears about it, totally opposed. Then she says, I thought it would be only to try my virtue, as Abraham's faith was tried, meaning when he offered Isaac, when he was asked to offer Isaac. And I totally know this feeling, because I thought when I was looking at going on a mission, well, maybe if I just fill out my papers and say I'm going to go, then I'll meet some great, wonderful person to marry and I won't have to go. So she's thinking, well, maybe it's just kind of theoretical, which wasn't true for me, and it wasn't true for her either. So she says, and I thought the Lord would love me better if I refused to believe in such a heinous thing, for the Lord loves virtuous women. So she's using her logic and her reason, and she's like, well, this is obviously an immoral thing, and maybe the Lord is just testing me to see if I will submit to an immoral and horrible thing. Okay, so that was one thought she was having. She said, I was perplexed. I did not have much to say. I felt very serious over it, and ... I made it a matter of prayer. Now, this is so awesome, because at first her instamatic response is, yuck, no way. Over a little bit of time, she starts thinking about it. Well, maybe it's just a test. Maybe, she starts trying to figure out how this could, how she could deal with this idea in her head. Okay. And then because she was still very worried about it, she makes it a matter of prayer. So she starts praying about it. And at this point, she's been married. Her last child, she has 8 children. Her last child was born in 1844. So we know that she would have been almost at the end of childbearing age. So she probably would have been, almost 50. Let's see, 18. Yeah, so she was born in 1804, so she would have been 40. There we go, 1844. Or about somewhere around there. So she's praying about it. She's thinking about it. She's struggling with it. She doesn't like it, but she's struggling with it, which is something that we are all going to do, right? I don't know. I guess there are women that don't struggle with it, but I struggled with it. She struggled with it. This is another quote. She says, on the Sunday morning following, after my husband and I were ready to go to meeting, so they're going to go to church, we walked out through our gate and my husband said, let us call in at John's. And that was his brother. Perhaps some of them will go to meeting. I'm not going to scroll too far here. Yes, I did. Oh, no, there it is. As we passed through the gate, so she's going to have a vision. She said, this is her vision. She says, as we passed through the gate, all creation was opened in vision to my view. As it seemed to me, we were as the grass of the field. I can see now how it looked as it ran off in the distance. Okay, so I want you to try to think of that. That all of creation, all of a sudden there's no time, there's no limit on what you can see. You see all of creation, and this is what Abraham saw. And the prophets of old, they would see, like Abraham sees his seed like the sands of the seas or the salt of the earth. And he sees this great expanse of life, and she describes it as the grass, that there were so many lives, it was like all the grass were different people, and she just sees this great expanse of life and creation. And she says, and then I saw plurality of wives, the celestial order of marriage, open to my view. So then she sees that all these lives, all these lives are related back to plural marriage, which means that there's husbands having more than one wife. And I'm just going to throw a little aside in here. Somebody was asking me about this, well, do you think it's really going to happen? How do you think that's going to be? First off, we're not praying about it like she did, because for her, it was right now, right then, could be real. We're just like, oh, that's a rhetorical thing. This is something to argue about online, right? This is just an idea. But for her, it was very real, and she was praying intensely about it. And but for us, I just want to ask you a question. When you go to church or you go to the temple, it's easier to see in some situations than others, but you look around, and if you want to count your audience, you'll see that if there's 100 people at church, probably 60, 65 of them are going to be women, and 35, 40 are going to be men. Yeah. So what does that tell you? That's just any day you go to church, there's going to be more women than men. And I just think if you're not ready to plan for that, if you're not ready to say that every single soul that lives up to what the Lord asked him to do is going to get the reward the Lord promised to give them, if the numbers are that way just every day in our regular church experience, you can kind of bet that's how it's going to be after we die. And that's why there's such a thing as celestial. That's why there has to be celestial marriage, so that there can be exaltation for every person. No one is left out. Okay, so that's just my aside. Okay, so go back to what she says. She says, I saw a plurality of wives, the celestial order of marriage open to my view, and I knew it was right and a virtuous principle and pertaining to the everlasting gospel of Jesus. So that kind of answered her question as to whether it was virtuous or not, because she was thinking, well, maybe if I'm virtuous, I will say no, I'll stand up against it, it's bad. But the Lord shows her, this is how I get to my children, the lives of my creation, spread like grass in a field, all these human lives. And all this creation. This is how I do it. I do it through celestial marriage and plurality of wives. She saw this. And then, now this is now that's awesome. Like, if that's all she saw, I would love that, because it's just one of those other things. It's not me, it's not today, it's what God is trying to accomplish for all of eternity. So that's why it's important. But then she has this other thing she sees, so I want to share that with you. Then I saw the authorities of the church and what they had suffered to establish this peculiar doctrine. It was a grand point in the gospel, and it had to be established in this generation, and there was no getting around it. It had to come forth. When I saw the labors of the brethren and their toils and sufferings, my heart was pained for them, and I loved them, and I pitied them. I have never heard, like in any other a women's comment, I had never heard anybody mention the brethren specifically. Like, you can see, like, when you read stuff about Joseph Smith, I'm going to read Orson Whitney's talking about his experience with polygamy. His mother was, Orson F. Whitney, Helen Mar Kimball, who married Horace Whitney. She was the 14-year-old wife of Joseph Smith. And it was not a consummated marriage. It was just a sealing, because he died like a year later. So, but we're going to hear about his perspective, his mom's perspective, on the next video I do, I think. But this is so interesting, because these men, they knew, like, they'd already seen all heck break loose on Joseph Smith. I mean, all he had to do was say he'd seen a vision, and everything went downhill from there. He said he saw God. He said he saw Jesus. I don't know why everybody got so upset about it, but they were super mad about it. Then he comes up with the Book of Mormon. They're trying to kill him. They're trying to get the plates away from him, which they don't really believe are real, but yet they're still willing to try to kill him to get the plates away from him. They're kicked out of Palmyra. They go to all these different towns. They go to Harmony. They eventually go to Kirtland. Then they go to Missouri, and now they're in Nauvoo. They've been kicked out of so many communities, losing their homes almost every time, sometimes being bloodshed, losing all their income, just being destitute. And now the Lord is like, okay, what I need you to do now is plural marriage. And you can imagine, knowing what they knew, how they knew that was going to go down, especially Joseph Smith. He's been dealing with this since he was 14. So around 1820, this is starting. So when he first gets this message from the Lord, this revelation from the Lord, we think it was the early 1830s. And he's already had 10 years of persecution. Okay? So you can see why he's kicking the can down the road. So that by 1842, when this starts to come out, I mean, he's had 12 years of thinking about this. And they say, maybe 1840, because things were starting to happen in 1841. But, and I don't know, everybody has a different opinion on Fanny Alger. I am just not convinced that Fanny Alger was a thing, because most of the reports of her experience were from kind of antagonistic people or in an antagonistic presentation. So I don't know. That could have been a thing. I don't know. But we know that it's kind of assumed that the first plural wife was Louisa Beeman. And that was quoted to be 1841. There's some questions. I heard Don Bradley saying he thought it could have been 1842 based on this guy's memory, who said he was quoting that they were at this certain house and that he remembered it happening there, but that house wasn't built to the next year. And if you're like me, I can't remember years super well. So 1841, 1842, somewhere in there. So anyway, but I want you to imagine, like, just knowing what is going to break loose upon you. how eager you would be to talk about this and to present it, and the delays in this. But she sees this suffering of these brethren, and she probably was in a timeless view, because the suffering that's going to happen to these men is pretty intense. Like the first anti-polygamy laws are written in around 1862, so they're already in Utah by then. But they're going to be put in prison, taken away from their families, fined. By 1987, the Edmunds-Tucker Act comes, and they are suddenly, the church loses all of its assets, its properties. The United States government is sending out armies against them. I mean, this was not lush kickback, weekend with this thing. This was like actively opposing the United States government and all of their culture. They were like, in your face, the Lord has told us to do this. So this is something that she sees, and because she sees what the brethren are going to go through, and like, also, sorry, aside, if you listen to like Heber Kimball, all these guys, this was like not easy for the men either. We live in such a sexualized society. We act like everything is about sex. And I think it's hard to imagine living in a time when like talking about sex was kind of a taboo. And you said very little about those kind of things. You just didn't talk about that. That wasn't polite, right? Now we just, everything, we define ourselves by our sexuality. So this is just, it's kind of an anachronism for us to be able to really understand how they would feel about it. I'm sure that was on their mind, that they're thinking, oh, this is too much sex for one man, But also it's it just wasn't talked about that way. So hold on, let me get my train of thought back. Anyway, they're gonna pay. The women it's gonna be difficult for the women too, but she sees this, and it gives her so much pity for the men that she says, I was no longer an opposer of the two-wife system. I did not speak of these things, but I pondered them in my heart. So now here's another interesting thing to think about. This was not common knowledge, okay? This wasn't church-wide. It kind of got told to the people that Joseph Smith told to tell. So like Hiram Smith would tell you, or Benjamin Johnson was, just trusted people were involved. And that's really important, because people that were trusted that then turned against them quite virulently. So like William Law, who was the first counsel in the first presidency with Joseph Smith, was super opposed to polygamy. And that's basically why Joseph Smith got murdered. William Law practically made that happen, or at least he was involved in the group that enabled that and made that happen. So it was it wasn't that Joseph Smith was, it was a matter of staying alive, that this was a very secret thing. So, if your life's at stake, you're going to take that very seriously. So anyway, I wanted to say one more thing. Oh, okay. Let's see. I'm going to go backwards, and then I'm going to go to her final comment on this, because it just is a tearjerker. Okay. Oh, maybe I'll do that first, and then I'll go back to that. So she says she says she wasn't an opposer anymore. She didn't talk about it because nobody was talking about it, but she had peace. She had come to peace with the idea. And her husband didn't marry a polygamist wife until 1858. So she waited for 14 more years before this comes, or at least 14 more years before this comes up for her. But she says, this is her closing statement, I realized the beauty and glory and exaltation connected with this heavenly principle. It was grand and glorious, and I felt wrapped in joy. Now, I don't know how many times you feel wrapped in joy, but I think the Lord was super generous with these women that were willing to consider this, because what they were going to do was going to be hard. And he gave them visions and surety, assurance, comfort, and joy, so that they could do what he needed them to do. Now, let me go back to this other comment that she says. I read through it, but I want to read it again because it's pertinent. So she says, when she was saying that she saw what they were going to suffer to establish the doctrine, she makes this comment. She says, it was a grand point in polygamy, talking about polygamy, it was a grand point in the gospel and had to be established in this generation. There was no getting around it. It had to come forth. So why? She sees what it's going to do. She sees that what the suffering is going to be. But then she says, this had to come forth now. Now that's an interesting point, because Joseph Smith had the doctrine since 1831 or plus, a little bit after that. He gets the idea. He basically mulls it over for 5 or 6 years. Then there's the Fanny Alger incident, which, like I say, I'm not convinced, but anyway, that comes up, and there's rumors, and who knows what that is, but nothing surfaces for the rest of the church. And then around 1839, 1840, Joseph Smith starts talking to, 1841, somewhere in there, it starts being discussed secretly and privately amongst faithful members of the church. And why was it so important that it had to come out? It had to come out right now. And you've heard the stories, and I don't have this referenced right now, I can't pull it up, but of the angel that's supposed to have come 3 times to tell Joseph, you have to do this, you have to do this. So why was it so urgent that it happened? And if you let's consider this. So Joseph dies in June of 1844. If he didn't establish polygamy, which he knew he was supposed to establish, I don't think anybody else would have been jumping in to establish that and to get it going. The people believed in Joseph Smith. They knew he was a prophet, and he was responsible to restore all the keys. Okay, so he had to get it going, and it reminds me of the other things that he established that didn't stick, but that he did establish, like blacks in the priesthood. He established a clear precedent for that. He helped establish the law of consecration, and he got those going, but those things didn't stick, and we had to do more work before we were able to. With blacks in the priesthood, took 33 years. With the law of consecration, guess what? We're not there yet. So that's still not even running. Who knows when that will happen? But for him, he had 3 or 4 years, and he had to get the law of polygamy. They didn't ever call it polygamy. They called it plural wives, or the principal wife, I've heard it called, or celestial marriage, eternal marriage, all these different things. They never did call it polygamy themselves, but because there weren't men that were having multiple husbands to a wife. So that's one of the reasons they said they didn't call it that. But anyway, so they it turns out to be like there's this little window of time that Joseph has to get plural marriage established so that it can do the work that it's supposed to do. So let's say it starts 1840, which just barely starts rolling. I think when Joseph Smith died, there were like 55 women in. I better not guess that, but it wasn't very many women that were involved in men. I remember the men were like 29, and maybe I don't know. I don't remember the number on the women, but it had to start rolling so that it could be established by the time we got to Utah, so that we could have this massive generational growth of families. And if it hadn't have happened, if Joseph hadn't have gotten it going at that time, it never would have happened. And then who knows if the immigration from England and the other countries, if it would have been enough to keep the church going. I really don't think it would have. I think that's why the Lord made that happen. So she sees this. She sees this in her vision. It had to be established in this generation. There was no getting around it. It had to come forth. And like she says, it was a grand point in the gospel. Okay. So this is her experience, and it's just, I just think it's so awesome. But it leads me to think about, the stories from church history where they talk about after the huge sacrifice to build the Kirtland Temple, there were angels walking on the top of it that people could see. The Lord appearing in the temple to Joseph Smith and other people being in the room. Let's skip to the Hans Mill massacre. Okay, Mom, so this gets me. Okay. Amanda Barnes Smith, her husband Warren, they're at Hans Mill. They get attacked, and so Warren and Amanda's son Sardius get killed. Alma, her youngest, I think he was like 9, gets shot in the pelvis, and the bullet goes through his pelvis on one side over his femur, and wipe. There is no more bone left there. He has no hip bone anymore. And she prays. She has this great experience. The Lord tells her what to do this, do that, do the other. She asks her son if he has faith that he'll be healed. Her husband is dead. His brother is dead. And he's like, yes, Mama. And he lays on the bed. And in 5 weeks, he's up walking around, and that whole space is filled with cartilage, and he had that the whole rest of his life. Like things like that. Just miracles in general. When you're facing a lot of persecution and you're getting kicked out of your homes and you're having to invite extra wives into your home, the Lord compensates you with visions like this woman had, and with knowledge and miracles for your own testimony and for your own faith. He will accommodate you. So for us, it's really a weird place right now, because we're not even living polygamy. Nobody's asking us to do polygamy. We can hardly stay married to one person at a time, right? And he's not asking us to do polygamy. But just the idea of that kind of a sacrifice is pruning the church. So like in the days when the idea first came out and it was a real, I'm going to call it a threat. It was a reality. That's better. Call it a reality. It was a reality. It pruned a lot of people out of the church. It was too much. And it was a lot too much. I mean, it kind of reminds me of Jesus when he gives the bread of life speech, and it says that there are all these people, he feeds them all. And then later he says, I know I've fed you, but really I am the bread of life. He says that about himself. I will keep you alive. I will be your sustenance. And the people are like, what do you mean? We're going to eat your body? What are you talking about? You're weird. This is weird. We don't like it. And they left, right? It says they stopped following after him. So they can see miracles. They could experience being fed. They were all good with that. But when he told them that they needed to rely on him as if he was their bread, they could not hack that. So they left. And that's what happened during polygamy. People couldn't hack it, and so they left. But what's happening now is people can't hack it, and so they're leaving. They don't approach it like Margaret West with prayer. How did she say that? She said she made it a matter of prayer. They don't approach it with faith. They approach it with fear and disdain and injustice. They are, I know, because I've had all of those feelings up close and personal, and they are not fun. But I just want to bear my testimony that this issue is so much more than it seems. And there is going to be the salvation of mankind on a scale that no one will be able, that is unimaginable for us. The Lord showed it to these women that were facing this for real, for them. But now, for some reason, we're having to face this same pruning. So don't get pruned out of the church. Just make it a matter of prayer and ask the Lord to show you where you need to go to get peace. And I don't, all my, it's still the scariest thing. But I feel like I'm not an opposer anymore. I just wanted to say one more thing about this woman, Margaret Cooper West. She, so her husband, when she was at 44, they stopped having kids. Then at 1858, so 14 years later, he marries two more women. He marries one woman who's in her 60s, and her husband has died, and she, it's sounding like, I wasn't there, but it's sounding like it was a marriage of taking care of her so she would have somewhere to be and somewhere to take care of her, because she never had any children with him, obviously. But he also marries another woman, Christiana was her name, a Scandinavian lady, and she has 6 more children. So this is when, he's getting old. He's probably almost, I know Margaret's birthday was 1804. So in 58, she would have been 54, and her husband would have probably been in his 60s, early 60s. And he has 6 more children with this woman. And I just I think it's interesting that the Lord gave her all that time, to get used to this idea. And she was important enough that she got this vision so early. And, not everybody got that same, the late Kimball didn't get that. But she got it for some reason, and the Lord knew she would need it, and so he gave it to her. So just, if you have something that you need when it comes to polygamy or any other principle of the gospel, just go to the Lord, okay? Go to the Lord and look for people that are also going to the Lord, that want to receive the rewards that the Lord has for us, and it will help you. I promise. And in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.